Hey, do you ever experience those instances where you sense as though your entire existence is precarious? That's precisely where I found myself a decade ago, confronted with a predicament I hadn't caused, but couldn't overlook. Allow me to provide some context. My father established this corporation from scratch. He excelled in his field, but when it came to finances, not so much. By the time I reached 26, fresh out of business school, the company was hemorrhaging money. My father, a decade older, was overwhelmed by stress. And what about my elder sibling, Adam? He wasn't contributing positively. Adam, at 31, while I was diligently striving to grasp supply chain networks and financial models, was, to put it mildly, enjoying himself. He possessed an innate charisma that perpetually positioned him as the favored one, and always would be. I was aware of this. It wasn't novel, yet it still caused discomfort. One evening, I discovered my father seated in his office amidst heaps of overdue invoices and contracts destined for failure. He didn't even register my entrance. His workspace resembled a disaster area, and he appeared to have gone without sleep for an extended period. When he eventually acknowledged me, he commented, "I believe it's finished, son." I'm uncertain how to rectify this. That statement impacted me more profoundly than I anticipated. I'm unsure if it was the gravity of his words or the realization that everything he had labored for might disintegrate. But something within me ignited. I assured him, I'll manage it. I'm not certain if he believed me at that moment, but he didn't object. Honestly, I think he was relieved that someone was taking charge. Since that point, I practically resided at the office. I comprehended every nuance of the corporation's operations, or more accurately, its dysfunctions. I familiarized myself with the financials, renegotiated agreements, and engaged with every client who visited. Many were reluctant to hear from me. I was youthful and lacked experience, and they had already lost confidence in us. I can't enumerate the instances I was rejected or faced closed doors. However, I persisted in appearing. People take notice of that, you know. Even those who initially disliked me began to consider me seriously after a while. The initial year was punishing. I was dedicating at least 16 hours a day to work. My father remained officially in command, but he delegated most of the decision-making power. I significantly curtailed unnecessary expenditures. This encompassed some of Adam's more lavish expenses. He had a tendency to charge personal costs to the company account, and no one ever intervened. I put a stop to it. He didn't react favorably. I remember him appearing at the office one day solely to deride me. "Look at you, pretending to be CEO," he remarked. "Don't get too comfortable. Dad won't let you seize it." I disregarded him, as usual. I understood the dynamics. Adam was the preferred one. He invariably received accolades for things he hadn't accomplished, along with the benefit of the doubt when he erred. But I wasn't pursuing this for validation. I was doing it because I refused to squander my father's diligent efforts. By the year's conclusion, circumstances began to improve. We weren't flourishing yet, but we also weren't gradually sinking. We started to reconstruct our standing. Clients returned, employees began to trust that their positions were secure, and the company was genuinely generating a profit. It wasn't substantial, but it was a start. Nevertheless, prosperity doesn't resolve all issues. My father was pleased with our advancements, but in his eyes, Adam could do no wrong. Adam was always lauded by him, regardless of my achievements. Even though Adam was seldom present, my father would extol his financial expertise during family gatherings. While everyone else discussed vacations, I was analyzing figures and devising strategies for expansion. It wasn't equitable, but life seldom is. I determined early on that I didn't require the recognition. If Adam opted to accept all the praise, that was acceptable. I had grander objectives. My father's commendation would have been appreciated, but what held significance for me was developing the firm into something commendable, something enduring, something I could reflect upon and affirm. Yes, I accomplished that. The company underwent a metamorphosis over the ensuing years. We commenced offering novel services, devised some distinctive technological solutions, and expanded into markets we had never envisioned. Revenue progressively escalated, from barely surviving to attaining 8 figures, and subsequently surpassing 9. It was surreal to witness something that was on the brink of collapse transform into a leader within the industry. I should have felt elated, but there was always this persistent underlying strain. Adam wasn't as absent any longer. As the company's success grew, he began to appear more regularly at the workplace, behaving as though he were an indispensable component of the operation. Everyone was aware of the truth, but no one voiced it, including Dad. In retrospect, I believe that was the initial indication that something was amiss. Adam resented the fact that the attention was no longer solely focused on him. He would jest about how I was overly serious or required a life beyond work, but there was an edge to his comments, hinting at a scheme I was oblivious to, yet I sensed it. Nevertheless, I remained focused and dedicated to my tasks. I refused to allow his insecurities to undermine all my relentless efforts, or so I convinced myself. In reality, I didn't think he was capable of causing significant harm. I underestimated him, which was my initial misjudgment. By the time our revenue reached $150 million, the fissures were becoming evident. I just hadn't grasped their depth. I sensed something was amiss the instant Dad convened the shareholder meeting. It wasn't unprecedented for him to assemble us, but this occasion felt distinct. The phrase he employed, a significant announcement about the company's future, possessed a sense of finality. I presumed it pertained to his retirement. After all, he had been discussing stepping back for years, especially after the company had stabilized. I wasn't apprehensive. If anything, I was prepared. I had been managing the company without an official designation for years, and this meeting appeared to be a procedural step to formalize it. I wasn't seeking commendation, but I considered this a logical progression. Who else could potentially assume control? Adam arrived tardily, naturally. That was characteristic of Adam. I was already seated at the boardroom table, reviewing my notes for the presentation I had drafted, when he entered, acting as though nothing was of consequence. He was perpetually smiling, shaking hands, and making light-hearted remarks. Everyone was captivated by him. That's the challenge with Adam. You almost overlooked the fact that he had never accomplished anything to merit the esteem he garnered. He possessed a talent for making individuals feel as though he was a part of things, even when he wasn't. He directed a wink at me as he took a seat, which caused a knot in my stomach, not because I was intimidated. Adam had never posed a genuine danger, but because it seemed calculated. I dismissed it, reasoning that it was pointless to let my imagination run rampant before the conference had even commenced. Dad entered a few moments later, appearing weary but determined. He commenced his usual discourse about the company's origins, its significance to him, and his pride in our collective achievements. It was somewhat exaggerated, but that was Dad's manner. He enjoyed establishing the atmosphere before delivering significant news. When he ultimately reached the crucial point, he rose, adjusted his spectacles, and stated, "It's time for me to relinquish the leadership." He paused, surveying the room as though anticipating applause or a similar reaction. After much deliberation, I've decided that Adam will be the new CEO. I swear time momentarily froze. My mind struggled to comprehend what I had just heard. Adam? The CEO? Surely this was an error. I glanced at Adam, and he was radiating joy. not surprised, not caught unawares, merely beaming. That's when the realization struck me. He had been aware. He had known all along. I didn't have the opportunity to contemplate it because Dad continued, asserting, "I believe Adam embodies the leadership qualities this company needs to move forward." He spoke of leadership qualities, the individual who was frequently late to meetings, the person whose sole contribution to the organization was depleting the entertainment budget for years. Before I could utter a word, Adam stood up, holding a folder. "I'd like to take a moment to address something important," he stated, his tone surprisingly formal. He opened the folder and began flipping through the pages, making a show of it. "Over the past few months," he continued, "I've come across some troubling discrepancies in the way certain decisions have been made." He glanced at me and then at the board members, as though attempting to gauge their responses. "It appears that my brother has been operating outside his authority." I was incredulous at what I was hearing. He proceeded to accuse me of executing unauthorized deals, exceeding my jurisdiction, and jeopardizing the company's reputation. He depicted me as a reckless, power-hungry individual who had acted irresponsibly while Dad was preoccupied. It was all very astutely phrased, just ambiguous enough to sound plausible without furnishing any concrete proof. I opened my mouth to defend myself, but Dad interjected. "Let him finish," he instructed, his tone composed but firm. Adam concluded his brief presentation by declaring, "I only bring this up because I care deeply about the company's future, and I want to ensure we maintain the highest level of integrity." Integrity coming from Adam. The irony was almost unbearable. When he concluded, the room descended into silence. All eyes were fixed on Dad, who inhaled deeply and announced, "After reviewing the situation, I've decided to terminate Marcus's employment, effective immediately." And my world disintegrated. Security personnel materialized from nowhere, standing by the entrance, seemingly awaiting the cue to escort me out. I didn't resist. I didn't even utter a word. What could I possibly say? The verdict had been reached long before the meeting, and I had fallen directly into their snare. As I was gathering my possessions, Adam leaned in and murmured, just audibly enough for me to hear, "Nothing personal, little brother, just business." That's when I comprehended it wasn't solely about the corporation. This was about him asserting something to me, Dad, and anyone who had ever drawn comparisons between us. He wasn't concerned with the company's trajectory. He was concerned with seizing it from me. I exited that boardroom with all the composure I could muster, but internally, I was enraged. Not only was I blindsided, but Adam had exploited years of diligent effort against me. He had not only usurped the position, but also the narrative. By the time I reached my vehicle, my phone was already inundated with messages from colleagues, acquaintances, and even several board members, surprised by the events, contacted me. I ignored all of them. I needed to concentrate. The drive home was blurry. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, attempting to understand why I had overlooked the indicators. In retrospect, they were all present. Adam appearing at the workplace more frequently, Dad being unusually secretive, and even some of the board members acting aloof recently. I'd been so engrossed in managing the company that I hadn't detected the storm brewing directly beneath my nose. Upon arriving home, I sat in the darkness for hours, striving to comprehend everything. How could Dad, the man who had witnessed me dedicate my life to this enterprise, select Adam? Was it unwavering loyalty, blind partiality, or was I simply so dispensable in his eyes? Whatever the reason, one thing was unequivocal. I was out, and Adam was in. But here's the crucial point about Adam. He's excellent at playing a role, but he's terrible at recognizing the consequences. While he was preoccupied with celebrating his triumph, he failed to realize I wasn't departing empty-handed. Far from it. I had invested years in establishing more than just a company. I had created leverage. And while they were busy plotting my downfall, they neglected to investigate the depth of my roots. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront Adam directly. That's precisely what he anticipated and desired, an opportunity to depict me as embittered and vindictive. No, I intended to do something far more astute. I was going to be patient, and when the opportune moment arrived, I was going to remind everyone who had initially built this empire. The first action I took was to contact several key employees who had remained with the company through all its challenges. These weren't prominent, high-profile individuals. Instead, they constituted the company's foundation: the IT personnel, a few senior developers, and 2 managers who had collaborated with me during those arduous early years. I knew they'd respond to my call because, unlike Adam, I had made the effort to cultivate relationships. I didn't disclose everything. I didn't need to. All I conveyed was that significant developments were unfolding behind the scenes. And if they trusted me, they should refrain from making any significant decisions for a few days. Nobody posed questions or expressed hesitation. That was all I needed to ascertain their allegiance. Next, I concentrated on the infrastructure. The benefit of reconstructing a company from its inception is that you comprehend where every component belongs. Over time, I discreetly established a separate entity to manage our most valuable assets, encompassing intellectual property, client agreements, and proprietary software. On paper, it was merely a support firm designed to optimize operations. In actuality, it was the core of the business, and I possessed complete ownership. Why hadn't I informed anyone about it? Because I anticipated something like this would eventually transpire. Perhaps not precisely this scenario, but I had a premonition that Adam would attempt some form of power maneuver. What about Dad? Let's just say I relinquished expecting him to support me a long time ago. With everything arranged, I dedicated the remainder of the weekend to gathering evidence. Metaphorically speaking, I meticulously reviewed years of documents, emails, contracts, and financial records, compiling proof of Adam's negligence, mismanagement, and outright questionable conduct. Some of it comprised minor issues, such as excessive spending and missed deadlines. Other issues were more severe: clandestine dealings with competitors, dubious transactions, and actions that imperiled the company's standing. By Sunday evening, I had accumulated a dossier substantial enough to thwart a bullet. But that wasn't the ultimate objective. My intention wasn't to utterly destroy Adam. That would have been too simplistic and would have achieved nothing. My aim was to remind everyone, Adam, Dad, and the board, why I was the one who had initially revitalized the firm. On Monday morning, I awoke earlier than usual, not because I had obligations, but because I desired to observe the repercussions in real time. I prepared coffee, set up my laptop in my home office, and connected to the company's internal network. Yes, I still possessed access. You'd think a man like Adam, with all his purported leadership capabilities, would have considered revoking my credentials immediately. But no. The first action I undertook was to activate the fail-safe I had programmed into the system years prior. There were no viruses or other malicious software involved. It was merely a concise script that redirected all internal communications to a secure server under my control. Emails, memos, meeting invitations. It all flowed through me. Then, I directed my attention to Adam's computer. Again, no hacking was required. He hadn't even altered his password. It was the same one he'd utilized since his university days. I uploaded a video file to his desktop and configured it to play automatically upon his login. What about the video? a compilation of his most egregious decisions, complete with timestamps and accompanying documentation. It wasn't sensationalized or overly dramatic. It was simply a stark, unvarnished reminder of his incompetence. By 8:15 a.m., the turmoil had commenced. Adam entered the office, looking self-satisfied as usual, and I observed him via the security feed. He sat down at the CEO's desk, activated his computer, and reclined in his chair as though he possessed the entire establishment. A moment later, the video began playing. Initially, he appeared perplexed. Then, his face reddened. He struck the keyboard several times in an attempt to terminate the file, but it persisted. Every screen in his office displayed the same film in a continuous loop. Concurrently, the notifications began. Board members, department heads, and principal investors' inboxes started to be populated one by one with emails. Each email contained a piece of evidence I had compiled, accompanied by a succinct explanation of how Adam's conduct had detrimentally affected the organization. I maintained a professional tone, no recriminations, merely factual statements. Down in the lobby, federal agents arrived. I had apprised the authorities of some of Adam's more dubious financial dealings, and they were prepared to interrogate him. What about the culminating detail? An email from the IT department announcing their resignation. They had all executed contracts with my subsidiary and were no longer employed by the corporation. The email concluded with a straightforward declaration: "We stand with the person who built this company." I observed Adam attempting to maintain his composure. He telephoned IT support, but no one responded. He called Dad, but his call went straight to voicemail. He even attempted to contact me at one juncture, but I didn't answer. By mid-morning, the board had convened an emergency meeting. Adam was summoned, and from what I observed on the security stream, it was not an amicable discussion. I didn't need to hear the specifics of that meeting to comprehend how matters concluded. By noon, Adam had been escorted from the building. I didn't feel smug or vindicated as I witnessed the events unfold. If anything, I felt a sense of relief. This wasn't about retribution, it was about equilibrium. Adam had spent years relying on charisma and manipulation, but when it truly mattered, he couldn't sustain it. What about Dad? Well, he had made his choice. I wasn't certain what would transpire next, but one thing was definite. The dynamics had shifted, and for the first time in a considerable period, I possessed complete command of the situation. The news disseminated rapidly. Employees were murmuring by the afternoon about federal authorities arriving, Adam departing, and the CEO being removed from the premises. In the era of instantaneous communication, this type of upheaval cannot be contained. By the subsequent morning, rumors had metamorphosed into headlines. Company scandal rocks leadership team. There were no specific names mentioned yet, but everyone comprehended who was being referenced. The stock price nosedived. It wasn't a gradual decline, it was a precipitous drop. Investors began withdrawing as soon as they discovered the company's foundational assets were no longer in its possession. That was deliberate, naturally. The subsidiary I had established to house it all had been legally independent for years, and it was now the bedrock of my new enterprise. Adam inherited a gleaming, hollow structure. Meanwhile, I maintained a low profile. I wasn't about to appear amidst this turmoil and be perceived as the individual who exacerbated the situation. I had already accomplished sufficient disruption to Adam's purported authority. The ensuing step was not about myself, but about the individuals who genuinely propelled the company's operations. That morning, I composed an email to every employee. It was concise and direct. Subject: a new opportunity. To the current staff, you have witnessed the events of the preceding day. Many of you are likely concerned about your future. I want you to know that your efforts and dedication have not gone unappreciated. I'm inviting you to join a new organization where your contributions will be respected, your jobs will be secure, and you'll be working with leaders that value innovation and honesty. Your jobs and benefits will remain unchanged, with more support and possibilities for advancement. If you're interested, you may learn more here. Link. There is no pressure. This is entirely your decision. Thank you for what you have done. You deserve better, and I hope I can deliver it. Marcus. By the day's end, my inbox was inundated with responses. People weren't merely accepting. They were expressing gratitude for providing them with an alternative. It was surreal to receive messages from individuals who had persevered with the company through its most challenging periods, informing me they believed in me, not the organization that had just imploded. Over 93% of the employees accepted the offer within hours. Adam, conversely, was not faring as well. By midweek, the investigation into his financial activities had become public knowledge. That's when the genuine improprieties surfaced. It was revealed that he had been siphoning funds via falsified vendor agreements. He had also been colluding with competitors, divulging client information in exchange for clandestine payments. I was cognizant of some of it, but witnessing it all documented in black and white was overwhelming. The authorities acted expeditiously. Adam was formally charged with fraud, embezzlement, and a multitude of other offenses. He was released on bail, but his reputation was irreparably damaged. The media had a field day, portraying him as the epitome of nepotism gone awry. Every facet of his misconduct, the lavish parties, the reckless expenditures, and the surreptitious dealings, was exposed. And then there was Dad. He maintained radio silence for the initial few days, most likely attempting to process what had transpired. I can only fathom his emotions upon realizing that the son he had trusted and favored for decades had metamorphosed into a colossal liability. The board was not spared either. The remaining investors demanded explanations, and the remaining members scrambled to mitigate the fallout. But what could they articulate? The company's foundation had been eradicated from beneath them. Everything that rendered the business valuable was now an integral part of my new operation. That week, I convened with the leadership team of my new employer. These were the individuals who had followed me out of the turmoil. The IT director, the head of operations, a few key managers, and the core development team. We gathered around a conference table in the new office space I had discreetly reserved months prior. It wasn't extravagant, just a functional modern setup with ample room for expansion. The primary order of business, I stated, is to ensure that everyone feels secure here. No unexpected developments or deceptions. We've all endured enough of that. Everyone around the table concurred. I could discern relief on their faces. For years, they had been caught in the crossfire of imprudent decisions and partiality. They could now concentrate on their responsibilities without apprehension about Adam's next move. The transition wasn't devoid of challenges. As anticipated, there were legal hurdles, and a few clients required additional reassurance that this was the appropriate course of action. But overall, matters proceeded more smoothly than I had envisioned. By the month's end, we were fully operational, and I could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Meanwhile, the original corporation continued its descent. With no assets, no leadership, and no discernible path forward, it became a cautionary narrative in the corporate realm. The stock price, artificially inflated by years of hype, was now worth mere pennies. Investors departed, litigation accumulated, and the remaining personnel struggled to secure new positions. Adam, predictably, attempted to manipulate the narrative to his advantage. He spoke to a local newspaper, asserting he had been framed and that the investigation was politically motivated. It didn't resonate. By that juncture, the evidence against him was irrefutable, and even his father declined to publicly defend him. In this scenario, justice wasn't about demolishing Adam, but about holding him accountable. For far too long, he had relied on others to rectify his blunders. This time, there was no one remaining to rescue him. When the dust settled, the message was unambiguous. Leadership isn't about titles or favoritism. It's about executing the work, earning trust, and accepting responsibility. Adam had failed on all 3 counts, and he was now facing the ramifications. I wasn't seeking retribution or gloating. I was resolute in creating something new, devoid of the errors of the past. The aftermath had been tumultuous, but it was also essential. Sometimes the sole method to repair something damaged is to deconstruct it and commence anew. A week after Adam's public disgrace, I received the call I was anticipating. It wasn't from Adam, but from Dad. He had been maintaining his distance ever since events deteriorated, but I knew it was only a matter of time before he contacted me. He left a succinct and direct message on my phone. "We need to talk. Your mother and I are going to see you tomorrow." I didn't reply. What could I possibly say? I comprehended precisely why he was calling. It wasn't an apology, and it certainly wasn't an acknowledgement that he had erred. No, this was about the consequences. The plummeting stock price, the litigation, the investors withdrawing, and the fact that his entire retirement fund was now invested in a company on the brink of collapse. The following morning, Dad and Mom arrived at my new company's office punctually. I had deliberately maintained the location understated, but I wasn't attempting to conceal it. They located me easily enough. When they entered, I realized how significantly they had aged in such a brief time frame. Dad appeared as though he hadn't slept in days, and Mom seemed to have been weeping copiously. They both sat across from me in the small conference room, the tension palpable. Dad was the first to speak. "Marcus," he said, his voice strained. "You've made your point, but we need to figure out how to fix this." I leaned back in my chair and folded my arms. "What precisely do you want fixed?" I inquired. "The mess Adam created? The company you permitted him to destroy? Or the reality that your retirement savings are worthless?" Mom winced, and Dad's expression hardened. "This isn't the time for blame," he added, striving to maintain composure. "We are family. We need to get together and figure this out." I nearly chuckled. Now he desires to discuss family. After years of permitting Adam to dominate me. After terminating me in the most demeaning manner conceivable. Now he was interested in solidarity. "You don't get to play the family card now, Dad," I responded calmly. "You made it abundantly clear where your loyalty lies." He sighed deeply and ran a hand over his face. "I didn't know what Adam was doing," he claimed. "Didn't you?" I retorted. "You may not have known the specifics, but you knew he was unqualified. You knew he was overspending. You knew he didn't show up half the time, and you let him take control anyhow." Mom began to interject, but I raised a hand to silence her. "Don't," I said, shaking my head. "You're not allowed to defend him either. You both made the bed. Now you want me to clean up." There was a protracted silence. Finally, Dad stated, "Your mother and I are in a difficult situation. Everything we have saved is related to their firm. If we don't work something out, we may lose the house." And there it was, the genuine impetus for their visit. It wasn't about Adam or the company. It was about finances. I inhaled deeply and leaned forward on the table. "I'm going to help you," I declared. Relief washed over their faces, but I wasn't finished. "This is how it's going to work," I explained. "I will acquire your company shares at their original value. That will allow you to keep your home and retire comfortably. However, There are some conditions. Dad frowned. What type of conditions? First, I said, you both sign a non-disclosure agreement. That means no telling anyone, friends, relatives, or reporters, what happened to Adam or the company. Second, you retire peacefully, no more tinkering or attempting to mend things. Third, the money is not free of conditions. You will receive a monthly allowance, and any significant expense must be approved by a trustee. Mom appeared poised to object, but Dad grasped her arm. That seems extreme, he responded cautiously. Extreme? I repeated, reclining back in my seat. Dad, I'm being generous. I do not owe you anything. After everything that had happened, I could have departed and left you to deal with the mess you created. But I am not doing this for you. I'm doing it because deep down, I still care about this family, even though you don't deserve it. That final line impacted more than I anticipated. I thought Dad was going to protest, but he just nodded slowly. Fine, he said. We'll sign whatever you need us to sign. Mom glanced at him with wide eyes. Leonard! It's the best we're going to get. He interrupted her. I stood up, signaling that the meeting had concluded. I'll have the paperwork ready before tomorrow. Once you sign, the cash will be transferred within 48 hours. They also stood, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. This was the man who had always urged me to accept responsibility, admit my faults, and strive for improvement. And here he was, crushed and defeated, pleading for a bailout from the son he'd neglected for years. As they departed, Dad looked back and said, "You're a better man than I gave you credit for." I did not respond. Words no longer held much significance to me, especially when they came from him. When the door closed behind them, I sat back down and stared at the table for quite some time. This was hardly the victory I had expected. It did not feel like a victory at all, but it was required. Sometimes, doing the right thing doesn't feel pleasant. It simply feels like a satisfactory conclusion. I didn't feel relieved or satisfied the day my parents signed the papers. Instead, I felt a peculiar sense of emptiness. It was finished. They had accepted the terms, and the money was on its way to them. I knew that was the correct course of action, but it didn't seem like a triumph. If anything, it seemed like I was finally bringing an end to something that had been broken for years. But life doesn't allow for introspection. While my parents adjusted to their new financial reality, I had a firm to run, one that, for the first time, was fully mine. The transfer from the old company to my new venture proceeded more smoothly than I had anticipated. Most of the personnel transitioned willingly, and the important clients remained with us. It wasn't solely about loyalty. They recognized the value of the relationships and mechanisms we'd established. If anything, the tumult surrounding Adam's demise had strengthened their faith in me. They realized who the true driving force behind the organization had been all along. One of the most significant adjustments I implemented was how we functioned as a corporation. I had learned a great deal from my blunders in the past, particularly regarding honesty and communication. Under the previous regime, decisions were frequently made behind closed doors, leaving people scrambling to adapt without a clear explanation. I wanted to do things differently. We began holding weekly all-hands meetings where I laid out everything: progress, challenges, and impending goals. No fluff, no business jargon, just plain talk about where we stood and where we were headed. The first few meetings were slightly awkward. People were unaccustomed to that level of candor, and I could see some of them were waiting for the other shoe to drop. But over time, they began to relax. They began to trust me when I claimed we were in this together. One of the most pleasant moments occurred around a month in. when one of the senior developers approached me after a meeting. He'd been with the company for years, one of the silent workhorses who completed the tasks without creating a fuss. "Marcus," he began, "I just wanted to thank you. I've been here a long time, and this is the first time I felt that someone is truly concerned about what we're doing." It took me by surprise. I didn't know what to say, so I simply nodded and said, "That means a lot. Thank you for staying with us." Those brief moments reminded me why I was doing this. It wasn't about proving something to Adam, Dad, or anyone else. It was about creating something meaningful, something people would be happy to be a part of. By the conclusion of the first quarter, we had achieved not just stability, but also growth. Revenue was increasing, client retention was at an all-time high, and we had even begun attracting new business. The team was energized, and the workplace was alive with a level of excitement I hadn't witnessed in years. One day, as I walked through the workplace, I overheard two employees conversing by the coffee machine. They didn't notice me, so I didn't interrupt. Honestly, one of them admitted, "This is the finest thing that could have occurred. The previous company was a complete disaster. I feel like we have a future here." The other person nodded in agreement. Yes, Marcus understands. He's not just sitting in his office issuing directives. He's genuinely developing something with us. Hearing that was more gratifying than receiving any award or accolade. It wasn't simply the figures or the growth that held significance. It was the fact that people believed in our objective. Meanwhile, the old corporation was merely surviving. The lawsuits were accumulating, the stock was essentially worthless, and the remaining employees were departing as rapidly as they could. Adam, from what I gathered, was attempting to avoid attention, but the damage to his reputation had already been inflicted. He was no longer a name people desired to be associated with. By 6 months, the new company had established itself as the industry leader. We were not only surviving, we were innovating. We developed a new product line that enhanced logistics for small firms, and it expanded more rapidly than we anticipated. It felt as though everything I'd been striving for over the preceding decade was finally converging. For years, I'd fought to prove myself to Dad, Adam, and everyone else who had ever doubted me. But in that moment, I knew I didn't have to prove anything anymore. I had created something genuine, something that would endure. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of tranquility. It's been 3 years since everything transpired. If I'm being forthright, I still reflect on it occasionally, not in a negative manner, but in a way that makes me question how I managed to survive at all. Despite the fact that it drastically altered my life, the entire incident feels like a distant recollection. My new company, ours, is flourishing. When I say thriving, I mean we've achieved every objective I ever envisioned. The team we assembled after departing the previous organization has evolved into something I am immensely proud of. We are not only profitable, but also respected. People in the industry regard us as the benchmark, the type of organization that others aspire to emulate. That feels rewarding, not because of the recognition, but because it validates that we are conducting things appropriately. But let us be candid, prosperity does not obliterate the past. Every so often, I find myself perusing old emails or examining news headlines about the consequences. Adam's name surfaces occasionally, usually as part of a cautionary narrative about leadership or nepotism. Last I heard, he was employed in a low-level position to avoid scrutiny. I don't maintain tabs on him, but it's challenging not to hear things when your name and his are still vaguely linked in some circles. My folks have settled into a serene retirement. Mom occasionally sends me emails with updates on their new pursuits, or the neighborhood potlucks they have commenced hosting. Dad, however, has remained silent. I haven't communicated with him since the day he signed the documents in my office. I don't believe he's resentful, but I also don't believe he comprehends how to reconstruct the bridge he incinerated. And frankly, I'm uncertain I'd permit him to attempt it. It's remarkable how much perspective time provides. When everything initially commenced, I was so intent on proving myself, demonstrating to everyone that I was the one who merited leadership. But 3 years later, I realize I'm indifferent to it anymore. People who know and collaborate with me already comprehend the type of individual I am. I don't need to proclaim my triumphs from the rooftops, and I certainly don't require validation from those who questioned me. For those who are curious how the quiet one emerged victorious, let me elucidate. While others were preoccupied with posturing and playing politics, I was executing the work. While they were generating noise, I was strategizing. Because ultimately, being the loudest or most ostentatious is not what defines success. It's about strategy, resilience, and recognizing what you're capable of, even when no one else does. The peacocks may attract attention, but what about the eagles? We are the ones who observe things from above. And that's the conclusion of the narrative, or the commencement, depending on your perspective. Thank you for remaining until the end. Please let me know if you have any inquiries, reflections, or anecdotes to share. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and activate the notification bell to remain informed about more astonishing real-life stories unfolding around you.